Hi, I'm Peter Haddock and I'm here at the GGR Group facility just outside London with one of my greatest podcast guests, Chris Matthew. Chris, we have spent a lot of time together. Chris, you work for Flannery Plant Hire as well, talking about all things for the industry for the last probably 3 to 4 years now. And now we're getting to another stage with this particular podcast where we're able to talk about electrification as well as the remainder of the works that you do for Flannery, because you are the first people to have the electric Faucin telehandler, but also you've had it for 2 years, grown the fleet, and now you've actually worked with Faucin, with the GGR Group, who are the dealer, and with MachineMax, that you've got a collaboration with and a partnership with to make sure we've got the data from the electric. So Chris, tell me a little bit about the journey and why it's significant for you that you're talking about it now 2 years on from actually taking the first in the world of these telehandlers.
It's very, very easy to launch a product. I think bringing from our perspective, perhaps the manufacturers would disagree, but once a product arrives onto the market, it's very important to then do that proof of concept. So how are your customers using it? Is it the charging infrastructure accessible? Has the runtime been suitable? So these are the sort of things that you can't answer on day one. So by the time you've run it for a couple of years, as we have, we've got a better understanding in terms of how do we activate these out on site going forward. So the position we're in now is we've got that better understanding. We know the use case and we understand the business case, and we've got a bit more of an understanding in terms of what sort of scenarios these machines really excel in, which is quite exciting.
And I think one of those scenarios I recently visited with the team was actually one of the older units that you'd got.
That's right.
Been working for 12 months with Morgan Sindall
Yep.
on a project in Birmingham where they're building a road that's actually going to eventually have electric buses going down it for the Commonwealth
Very
Games this road
exciting.
for. That was really exciting because they had had the longevity of using that equipment and they were a test bed for you getting the data from that particular project, weren't you? That's where it's all about, isn't it?
I think so. I think with electric machines in particular, we need to remove ourselves from just thinking it's a replacement product from something that we've had before. There's a bit of a behavioural change. We need to understand how these machines interact with the other machines on site, the way we're going to refuel them, etc. So with Morgan Sindall, it's a great example of a client who committed to it quite early on and kept the product for 12 months, as you say. So they learnt the subtleties of it. They appreciated that there's a different way of putting that machine to work. And ultimately, they were able to realise and measure the benefits, which again, you've mentioned with MachineMax, they've now got this window in terms of how that machine has performed and the savings that they've made.
And it is that window which is really important because, you know, a lot of people are progressive or regressive or whatever you want to say within the industry that says, yes, it's for us, no, it's for us, no, we don't want that, yes, we want that, you know, and it's electric is a real divider in the industry. We know government, it's coming down from the government, tier 1 contractors like Morgan Sindall are wanting it from plant hirers like yourself. But you can't just invest in something and not get a return as a plant hire either, can you?
No, absolutely. But you've just said it there. Change is something that is potentially threatening to all of us, whether it's your car at home changing from petrol and diesel to electric or hybrid. It needs something to happen. So with Morgan Sindall, what they were quite quick to identify was that there is a little bit of a change, as I've already alluded to, the way that we put that machine to work. But the window, the opportunity to see those savings, to see the CO2 savings, to understand the kilowatt hours consumed versus fuel and understand what that comparison looks like, that's invaluable. But without it, it just feels a bit awkward and a bit clunky. So I think having that window really helps that change happen.
So the other thing about change and the other thing about equipment is obviously equipment is only any good if you've got an operator in it. And obviously from Flannery, you do both hiring equipment on its own for somebody else to find the operator, but also operated plant. And
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
when you've been using that particular unit with your own operators, you've been again able to actually talk to them and train them on how to use an electric machine to get the best out of it. What's been that sort of process and how has that helped you again look at those use cases and the data?
We've learned some very interesting behavioural trends in terms of how telehandler operators, given this example, actually go to work in the first place. And you know, you might assume that a machine that's on hire all day is constantly working, but the reality of deliveries arriving on site is that there might be peaks in the morning or the afternoon and periods of the day where the machine is less busy. So help understand those, identify when the machine needs to be in certain places has been quite an eye-opener actually. So you mentioned about the operator in particular. I think anybody who has driven an electric car will know that the feel of the machine, the feel of their car in that example is slightly different. So the operators take a little bit of time to get used to it. So we should stop sugarcoating the fact that these are just jump in and it's all completely normal. It feels a bit different. It's a different attack on the senses in that the machine is nearly silent. But what I would say is after a little while of operating the machine, almost all the operators that we've had come back out and say, oh, this is fantastic. It's instant power, it's instant torque, the hydraulic motors are incredibly quiet and there's no vibrations. So why wouldn't you want to work in a machine like that?
Yeah, and I spoke to the operator, Lucky his name was, when we went to the Morgan Sindall site, and he said, yeah, listen, I have had a problem with it, but once I've got used to it, I wouldn't go back, mainly because of the noise and the vibrations that you get with an engine. And he was really comparing it like for like as well with other products. But the other challenge for him was actually when somebody else came to use that product and they found it difficult to use and then had to ask him for advice, because it is that different sort of feel, and also the controls are similar. But it's like you say, electric car, put your foot down, wow, you go instantly,
Yep.
you know, and so there is an element of safety that pulls into the way in which we need people to understand how things like that operate, not just for the operation from the operator's perspective, but also there's not a noisy telehandler working in the yard anymore, is there?
Yeah,
there's a quiet one. And so a lot of these things, you know, are critical, aren't they, when it comes to adoption of this sort of technology?
Yeah, absolutely. We need to appreciate that we can't just throw the keys to someone and assume that they can set off and operate it, even if they've been operating the same machine for years previously. It's important when any hire company delivers an item of plant that they're given the opportunity to offer a familiarization. You know, has the operator had the opportunity to understand the controls, if there are any differences or any subtleties that they need to look out for? So I really think that's important. And you mentioned another good point with regards to people-plant interface around yards. You know, plant traditionally has made noise. Now these machines, of course, come with white noise beacons, white noise alarms, so that they've got the same familiar sounds, but you don't have the engine rumble. So we need to brief all of our site teams that there are some new things happening on site and they need to be more aware of their surroundings and not rely on sound alone.
And there comes another element, the site itself. Now, this site is changing. You know, again, I'll talk about Morgan Sindall. They set up their site and they modelled it exactly where machines were going to be, where the infrastructure was going to be. They ran a fleet of electric vehicles as well, so they had all the charging infrastructure for that. And there is your Flannery telehandlers nestled next to those electric vans that they were using. But the whole infrastructure is important, not just when you're looking at electrification, but where you put your Bowsers, where you know you have any sorts of welfare units and how they all interact together. That's part and parcel of understanding how you use a machine and where it should be, isn't it?
Absolutely. And let me caveat my answer by saying I'm not an electrical technician and the restrictions on site are not something that I'm directly familiar with. But it's important, as you say, Peter, that we plan in advance how we're going to set up our sites. And if we're going to run electric fleet or a part electric fleet in the first instance, is we know where we're going to charge those either through break periods or overnight. Now, you've highlighted a potential challenge there in that we're beginning to adopt EV chargers for our cars. But I don't believe for one second it's appropriate that we charge our plant next to where our cars are leaving at 5 o'clock in the evening. I don't think that's particularly safe. So do we have the space to facilitate EV charging in an appropriate safe location? And the next challenge, particularly for tracked machines, is it even efficient to track that machine back a considerable distance to get to the charger? Are there alternative methods in where we can take some sort of charging infrastructure to the machine? Now, I'm not going to speculate what those charging infrastructures might look like, but you know, we can't assume that where once we had a diesel machine and we used to take a Bowser to it, it's going to be as easy and as safe to take a big heavy battery out to that machine. So again, it goes back to how you started the question in terms of how we're designing these sites. And we need to accept that with the technology that we currently have today, electrification might not be the total solution. We need to accept that there's a mix of solutions, but I certainly see electric as part of every site.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you've really got to look at it from a plant hire's perspective. When you've got an excavator like that, tracking, that's the biggest wear part, the biggest cost is the track maintenance with a machine like that. And so fundamentally, when you're doing that, you're adding cost into the situation. So you're also adding hours to the machine that are unproductive hours. We talk about idle time within the diesel context. Well, that's almost similar with an electric context of using the machine when actually we need to make sure we're not doing that as much. So we've got those barriers that come and play together. So tell me a little bit though, how the electric world that you're now in is matching and marrying with the diesel world that we're in. The red to white diesel obviously changed as increased fuel costs. We're now talking about HVO as well as a fuel used on site in a lot of projects. What have you done to marry all that together so that you can talk like for like and compare?
I think that's a good question. It's a hard question because I don't think the marriage is perfect yet. And let's not be naive and say that we've mastered this. We need to accept as an industry, for us to progress to a zero carbon future, we need to understand that there are multiple solutions. There's going to be no one size fits all approach. So that marriage needs to have a synergy and a flexibility that enables us to transition from one machine to another. We need to be brave enough on sites to say that where we had an electric machine this week, next week it might not be appropriate for the tasks that we're taking on. So is there an alternative technology which might involve either an HVO machine or a clean diesel machine, a traditional stage 5 machine, right the way through to hopefully hydrogen at some point in the future. So let's not paper over the cracks. We can't necessarily plug one technology in to replace another. So that marriage needs to be more of an understanding in terms of what are you using it for, where is our infrastructure, what is the cost base in terms of having that infrastructure in the place we're going to do the work, and if it's deemed prohibitive, is it safe to consider moving a refueling source to that site? So whether that's a hydrogen bowser or a big battery bank, the answer to those questions might be no, Peter. It might be that the safest, most effective thing to do is to use a traditionally powered machine in the short term and then switch back when appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that you're absolutely right. You know, it's horses for courses, and we recognise that there is a space and a place for things. But what we are seeing, Chris, is a massive kind of huge expansion of clean air zones.
Yes.
And we're seeing a massive impact of that on the vehicles you can use, whether it's, you know, electric cars going into cities for free and diesel's paying, and that's going to impact the plant as well. So you talk about that investment strategy when, yes, stage 5 engines are a part of that as well, but electric becomes a new challenge, but also becomes a new solution as these zones grow and as the demands from government and the tier 1 contractors that have to work in those spaces change. How have you seen that develop with, for example, the new Birmingham area that's come in recently? And what are you hearing from your customers in that space?
I think that's quite an exciting area of development. Now, traditionally, I say traditionally, in the last few years, these development zones have been in urban areas. There's been huge regional investment in some of these urban areas to put in that infrastructure that we're going to rely upon for construction as well as for commercial and domestic travel. I was in Canary Wharf very recently, and you look at the number of EV charging points there. There is no reason that you require a traditionally powered machine, particularly in the smaller scale, the 1.5 to 3 ton sort of range, because they can be plugged in. So that negates that issue of how are we going to charge and power these machines, because the infrastructure is being built in, it's being designed into these areas. Our challenge is how we then expand that out. You know, so as soon as you get into large scale brownfield development or greenfield development, you know, that charging infrastructure isn't there. So then we've got that debate in terms of how we move forward with those areas.
And that kind of brings me on to the other element that we don't have in those sort of areas sometimes, which is connectivity with 5G, because we're talking about data here as well with MachineMax. You know, you're using that platform to collect data on all your equipment. Well, a connected worksite is what you're talking about there. You can't have a connected worksite without 5G, 4G connectivity as well. So we are seeing the future potentially for these greenfield sites in particular to have hydrogen infrastructure, electric infrastructure and 5G infrastructure put in before you might even get onto the site. Do you think that's a reality that's going to come down the line?
I think we're seeing it now, and I know you've been to some certain sites that have really encompassed that from the beginning. It's part of this design element where if we as construction, the greater sector, consider the things that need to be done before we put the first spade in the ground, I think that IT infrastructure, that connectivity, the 3G, 4G, 5G signal, also, it could be anything to do with the satellite comms, for the machine control, the GPS. All of those things need to be in first before we arrive. And then we're designing our compounds so that we've got safe, secure areas where we can charge plant and vehicles separately from one another. I really think gone are the days where we arrive on site and we point to where we're going to put cabins and we kind of hodgepodge it all together. I don't think that's the site of the future at all.
I think you're right as well. And I think we're seeing the way in which you've got to put those welfare units and map that site actually is far more sophisticated now. 3D machine control can dig the holes, can do everything else. You can map all the site before you've even gone onto a site, you know where things should be, and so you can be a lot more efficient. And that's where it comes down to, once you've got that connectivity, you can do a lot with it. You talked about machine control, and I know you use key machine control partners with Flannery, but the real crux of it is knowing what the machines are doing and understanding the value that the machines are delivering on site, the efficiency, the productivity, the location, the activity that's going on. And so you've been doing that with MachineMax on your diesel fleet, and now you're able to do it with the electric Farasin models as well. So what you're doing is you're collecting an awful lot of data that then is actually demanded of you now by tier one contractors. Tell me what the difference that makes to you to be able to show people these things, and what's been the feedback from those customers, because they're probably like, well, we weren't expecting you to be able to do this, now we can see this, we can understand it more.
It's thrown up some interesting challenges, and you and I have been talking about data collectively now for many years. Firstly, our journey with MachineMax has been critical to aggregate the entire fleet. So it doesn't matter which OEM we choose to buy from, what type of plant. I need data in a consumable format. So consumable is defined as something easy to use, something in bite-sized chunks that isn't overwhelming to the user, but looks the same across all the different types of plant. So we've worked hard with MachineMax to deliver that solution, and we've plugged all of our various OEMs in, including with the electric telehandlers. Now what's really interesting is, and this is particularly driven by some of the environmental pressures of the fuel price, labour shortages, part shortages, even whole plant shortages, clients are having to become more efficient. There are challenges back to us as one of their hire companies, one of their suppliers, to say, well, how are we using our plant? Now, I'm pleased to say that because we've been on this journey for a good number of years now, we can not only give them a window in terms of how their plant is performing today, but we've got some fantastic benchmarking data. And you raised the point just then, Peter, in terms of, there's this element of surprise where clients say to us, oh, I didn't know you knew that about us and our machines, which can be a little bit intimidating. So it's important that we don't throw data at people, and we're on this journey together to say, okay, well, we accept now that there are pressures that we're all feeling at work and at home in terms of the cost of living crisis and the cost of work crisis, which I think is becoming paramount as well, which is right, well, okay, let's not worry about what's gone before us. We'll use that as our benchmark. We've got some key learnings that we can take from it, and we can set some really good measurable targets, some smart targets now that will deliver benefits. But what I would say, and I don't want to stress this point too much, but we're surrounded by words like innovation and, oh, data's fantastic, isn't it new, isn't it wonderful what we can do? We do need to park that mindset. This isn't innovative. The data has been there for a very, very long time. It's how we use the data. Now, I'll allow that to be labelled as innovative. So we need people to be appreciative and understand that if they actually engage with it and speak with their hire companies and people like MachineMax, they can do a lot now with their machinery. That's great. That's the innovation. So learn, ask questions.
And I think that's absolutely right. And I think when you look at a site, there are a number of different things that come to mind. The first is, have you got the right equipment for the right application, for the right site? Is that equipment going to need to be changed when you go and the transition from summer to autumn, like we're doing, to autumn to winter? And what does that look like? Because we all know the big word, the big idle word, is the one that's thrown up at people. Idle time comes when inefficiencies are there within the process. When you've got data that's giving you information real time, but also giving you information over a trend time over that period of when you've been working, you can see how things have changed. So when the weather starts turning, it's starting to get raining recently, Chris, we've had a lot of hard ground, that changes the dynamic of what's going on site. So we can match just real world with the data that we're getting off the machines to actually be better. Now that requires a certain amount of intelligence, not just from looking at the data and seeing what it's saying, but actually from having the experienced people on the ground and making sure they've got access to data on their iPhone or their smartphone. How are you finding that process? Because I know you've invested in a very, very large mobile training facility of two recently that's not just focused on training operators, but also exposing managers and site operatives to those conundrums, for want of a better word.
No, that's a good description, and we use the mobile training centres exactly for that. So as well as training our operators, bringing those black hats in and giving them the confidence that data isn't scary, because there's this misconception that data is going to take all our jobs, or it's going to make operators redundant, or indeed change the entire workflow on the sites. And whilst that might be the case, it's going to create loads of new opportunity for people to interpret this data to be a little bit more effective and efficient. So we've created an avenue where people can have a safe space to come and learn. And we use MachineMax to support us, whereby they come in and they explain some of these trends, and they help customers go back through their own data and potentially use a weather overlay, which is always quite interesting to say, well, look how effective you were on a dry sunny day versus how you were over a sustained wet and windy period, and some of the actions that you might want to consider. Now, no hire company in their right mind wants to see machines go off hire, but I'm brave enough to say, listen, if we are clever enough to forecast a sustained period of rain in the following week, potentially suspending or off-hiring 1 or 2 machines might make the entire operation 10, 15, 20% more effective and save some money and some carbon in the process. Now, I'm happy to say that out loud. I'm happy to get that on record, that that's what this industry needs if it's going to drive efficiency through looking at data. But you're right, Peter, we have to train people. We have to train people to be brave enough to make those decisions in advance. There's no point making it on Monday when you're in a gale force storm and bucketing down with rain with all your trucks stood.
No, and also it comes down to the day-to-day and the minute-to-minute running of a site as well, because what's happened? Well, say for example, the prime mover has gone down, and all of a sudden we've got a tailback of ADTs, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ADTs that are just sat there idling, not doing anything. Right, over a period of time, that might get back to people. When we've got data that is live, that is real time, and those machines can also talk to the project managers, talk to the site managers, talk to your team, talk to the engineers that are going to come out and fix it, well, that process changes dramatically. And all of a sudden, we've got less of a big traffic jam, we've got less idling, we can tell everybody, switch off the machine. Because there's something happened there that isn't going to be fixed in the next 5 minutes.
Yep.
You know, that changes again the mentality of what you're talking. You've said, I'm putting it out there that we're doing this. You're equally going to be able to put it out there that we now can give you the information that says we need to stand down for 20 minutes or whatever, or we've got an issue there where somebody hasn't refueled that unit and it's gone down. Well, actually, no, we've prevented that happening, Peter. There isn't that tailback of ADTs because we were pinged before that particular unit hadn't been refueled. We notified the team and that was refueled before that could happen. That's the kind of thing you're saying, isn't it? That change in mentality.
Well, and I'd like to build on your example. We've got a great case study happening at the moment up in Perth where we've got it's a large earthworks job spread out over quite a long linear route, and we're using live GPS tracing. And the motivation for that is we want to work out our trip cost per tonne. So, you know, we're using the payload indicators to record how much is in the skip. We're working out exactly how far and how fast we're travelling within the safe confines of the speed limit on site, and we're working out how long that's taking to get back. And the bonus is we're recording where the spoil is getting dropped in the first place. But what we're able to do, the prime mover, is to understand, right, well, we've got 10 trucks working in circuit, but 3 of them are bunching up. So we can send speed alerts to the 2 behind to slow them down. And you might think, well, why would you slow them down? But if you're moving your ADTs at a constant speed and allowing the appropriate gap to build to load the ADT in front, so approximately 1.5 to 3 minutes, then everyone keeps moving as opposed to creating that traffic jam, which inevitably happens, particularly around break times or refueling times, that kind of thing. So it builds on your example in terms of, right, we know that the optimum number of trucks on this haul route is 10. We're not guessing, we know that that's the spacing. And that we know exactly how long it takes to load each one to the correct safe load, and we know exactly where we're going. If that haul route changes, there's an algorithm which is really straightforward to say, well, we've added half a mile to the haul route, we can fit 1 more truck. Or indeed, we've shortened the haul route because we're doing something else. We need to take 4 trucks out and stand those down. So we're keeping those trucks moving rather than the culture of, well, we've got 10 trucks, so we'll run 10 trucks. And the fact that the safe site speed limit is 20 miles an hour and they're all doing 7 on average, or we've got long traffic jams. So those are the kind of things that I think is the next stage on from looking at idle time. It's actually identifying the facets that are really going to make a pound for pound difference. And if you think I'm nitpicking with this example, the kind of savings that we're talking about here are tens of thousands of pounds per month. So it's not small change. You know, it really is making a difference.
I think, you know, when you look at fuel and the price of fuel, and when you look at the fact that we've got all these efficient machines, there's no way on earth that we should be running them inefficiently. Because, if that is the case, we're throwing all of the rules out of the rule books. When the manufacturers launch a new machine that's 30% more efficient, well, it's not if it's not being used effectively. And again, it comes back again to this loop. And I know that you work on your loop very, very well, because it is the operator loop. We see all this data, all this technology. The engine is the heart of the machine. That's going to give you a lot of information and data. But the brains is the operator. Definitely. And so when we're looking at things like the haul roads you talk about there's other elements that come into play. Are you seeing that haul road is degrading? Are you seeing the fact that we've got a lot more braking happening because of different incidents? Because there's a big pothole that has come onto that particular part. We can see that now, can't we? Yeah. When all the data and all the information gives us that. Why have we got that cluster, like you said, of the 3 machines, or that cluster of activity? Braking, again, using brake pads, using the machine, wear parts, therefore costing more. And then all of this stuff comes into where you've got what I said at the start, was the connected work site that's connected for the right reasons. They're connected for productivity, efficiency, connected for sustainability, but not forgetting the importance of the operator community, who are actually physically seeing the work site and saying to people, look, we can understand this data as well, sharing it with us. We need to improve there because we think we can save money and save fuel. And like you said, that's a $10,000 question sometimes.
Absolutely. I think there's 2 parts to the example you gave there. And what we must remember, and particularly to your audience listening to this, that we're not losing the humanizing side of this. We don't want the operators to become robots. The fact that they can see the haul road that's degrading, they need to be able to use that as a reason in terms of, well, the data's saying that we've got bunching happening. So a human, for now, needs to interpret that and interrogate it. So why is it? So whether that be an automated drone survey that could potentially go and look at the quality of the haul road, or indeed we've got a banksman who is able to go and quite visibly see that we need to either get a dozer or a grader out. Those things are still part of this. But the other element to this, which I want to touch on, is part of the culture change that we're seeing with operators now. We're working very hard with our operators through processes like the Eco-Operator training course, where they're taking pride in the fact that they're keeping that constant speed. They're keeping their idle to a minimum. We've got operators now who are very, very focused on their litres per hour, because it's almost a challenge. They want to be better. No one wants to be at the bottom of a leaderboard. And clients are paying attention too. They want to know that suppliers like Flannery and the operators who work for us are being the most effective they possibly can be. So those operators are taking it upon themselves to go, well, hang on a minute, to whoever their line manager is, we've got an issue in terms of this road crossing, or we've got an issue with regards to how many trucks we've got going on, or the time it's taking me to get loaded. So they're challenging back, and I think that's a really healthy way that our sites are developing, as opposed to what might be a traditional methodology, which is where they just sit back and say, well, listen, I'm here to drive, I'm not here to have a voice, and I want to get away from that. I'm really keen that these drivers voice their challenges that they're seeing out on site.
Yeah, and I think data doesn't lie. Because at the end of the day, the operator may feel that in some cases, that data's been used against me. No. Just flip it 180. The data doesn't lie. The stuff's there. If you're telling someone that this is happening because of that reason, you have got the data to back you up. Yeah. So therefore, you have that right to go and talk to the line manager, go and talk to the site operative, go and talk to your other operators and say, listen, I'm seeing this. Are you seeing it? Yeah, I am. Guess what? We're sharing. We're starting to talk. We're starting to become a community that makes a difference. And every little drop we don't burn actually is better for the environment. You're having younger operators come through that I've talked to. One of the first things that they say to me when I have a conversation is they say, we actually want to play our bit. Yes, we want to earn some money, but we recognise we're operating the latest equipment. We can make a difference on emissions, because it's important to them. Similarly, older operators have children and we have children. So it's not something you can just shy away from now. And I think when we understand that, and when we learn how to do things better, and when we use data for a positive change, then that's having a different story altogether. And I think that's probably why I like the fact that, one, we're seeing all of this data coming through. Two, we're seeing operators supported so that they can be better operators and trained. Then, more importantly, we're training their managers to show them what the operators can do. And all we're doing then is feeding all of that back into the Flannery business so that Flannery can be better right the way through to your clients. And ultimately what happens then is you get asked back, Chris, to do some work. And this is why I've loved this podcast today, because it's not just our first podcast, folks. So we've talked many times, as Chris said at the start, and it's great to see the continual evolving Flannery, this time a little bit more electric than before, but certainly focused on the environment, productivity and efficiency. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you, Peter.